They never meant for you to hear this. The archives were sealed, the records burned, and the bloodline erased. But the walls never forget. And tonight, you will hear what they tried to bury. Blackwood Asylum. You've seen its ruins on postcards, reduced to a broken silhouette on the horizon. But you haven't heard what it was built on, nor the family that owned it. The Blackwoods weren't doctors. They weren't caretakers. They were keepers of something older, something they swore their blood to feed. The first stone of the asylum was laid not for healing, but for hunger. Witnesses claimed the foundations were salted with ash and marrow, not to bless the ground, but to mark territory. Because Blackwood Asylum wasn't a place for the insane, it was a vault for the voices that lived beneath it. The family had known this for centuries, their lineage traced back not to healers, but to ritualists. Every son born into their line was branded at birth, not baptized, branded. A spiral cut into the heel, a mark that never closed, that bled whenever the asylum demanded tribute, and it always demanded. You've been told that asylums were cruel, that patients were tortured, neglected, forgotten. But Blackwood was worse, because no one who entered its gates was ever truly insane. They were chosen. Pulled from their homes, dragged from their beds, erased from their histories. And once they stepped inside, they weren't called patients anymore. They were called offerings. Do you understand? The screaming wasn't madness. It was music. The cries, the scratching, the sobbing. It was a choir arranged by geometry. Blackwood's architecture was not designed to confine, but to channel. Each hallway aligned to an ancient diagram, each ward placed like an organ stop in a pipe of sound, and in the center, always in the center, the Blackwood bloodline itself, watching, listening, recording. The family's journals, what little survived, speak of the night bells. 3 rings, always at the same hour. 3:13 a.m., the hour of surrender. The moment when another voice joined the chorus, not human, not even mortal. Patients would vanish from their cells. Guards would look away for one blink too long, and then there would be silence where a man once screamed. No struggle, no sound, just absence. And when they checked the ledgers at dawn, the names were gone too. Ink bled away from the page, as though the asylum itself had swallowed them whole. Now tell me, do you really believe this was coincidence? Or do you feel it, even now, the tug at the edge of your memory, like something you were meant to forget? The Blackwood family's origin was never noble, never sanctioned by crown or church. Their bloodline was a curse passed down like an inheritance of shadows. The first of them, Elias Blackwood, was no physician but an exile, banished from the continent in the late 1500s after being caught in forbidden rites in Prague, where witnesses swore they saw him speak to something that had no face, only a crown of eyes. He fled England under another name, yet when he resurfaced decades later in the north, land records mysteriously shifted into his possession. The documents bore no royal seal, no legal authority, only a mark burned into parchment, a spiral with 7 hooks. That same spiral appears on the inner walls of the asylum centuries later, scratched by countless hands that could not have known of Elias or his mark. Do you understand what that means? It means the mark was not passed by memory, but by infection. Once you entered Blackwood's gates, the knowledge wrote itself into your flesh, whether you wanted it or not. Elias's descendants claimed to heal, claimed to shelter the lost and the broken, but what they really did was harvest. Their estates were always positioned on liminal grounds, between river and forest, between hill and hollow, always where something older already whispered. And when the asylum was commissioned in 1792, its blueprint was not drawn by an architect of record, but by a child, 8 years old, heir to the Blackwood name. He never spoke, never wrote, except for the plans. When they asked how he knew the dimensions, he simply said, They told me. Who were they? No one dared ask twice. The asylum was raised stone by stone, brick by brick, its halls spiraling inward like a labyrinth with no center. But there was a center. The Blackwoods kept it sealed, a chamber beneath the chapel, built not of brick but of bone, vertebrae stacked, fused, polished until they gleamed like ivory. No mason signed his work, no laborer remembered carrying the materials, yet the chamber existed as if it had always been there, waiting. And when the first patients arrived, the asylum did not creak or groan like new wood. It breathed. The walls were damp as skin, the halls pulsed with a faint vibration, and the doctors whispered among themselves that the building had accepted its offerings. From the very first night, screams echoed not from pain, but from possession, as though the patients' voices were being dragged out of their throats by something beneath the floor. And in their journals, the Blackwoods wrote one phrase again and again. The vessel is awake. The early years of Blackwood Asylum were cloaked in silence, as if the entire countryside colluded in keeping its existence hidden, but silence itself is a language, and in that silence men vanished. Families who surrendered their kin at Blackwood never received letters, no reports, no records of progress, only the void. Yet at night, villagers swore they heard something travel on the wind, not screams, not weeping, but a low vibration that rattled windows and made unborn children twist in the womb. The Blackwoods called it the Song of Alignment, claiming it was proof that their work had begun, but those who lived closest to the grounds whispered another name, the hunger. The first disappearances were not patients but attendants, men hired for menial labor, sweeping corridors, hauling water, tending lamps. They signed their contracts with eager hands, believing it was honest work for honest pay. Within months, they were gone, not fired, not fled, gone. Their families came to the gates, demanding answers, and each time, the Blackwoods presented a ledger with the name erased, the ink dissolved as if the paper itself had digested the memory. Those who pressed harder were warned with quiet menace, reminded of debts, reminded of secrets, and so the silence deepened. Inside, rituals became routine. Every third night, patients were not treated but arranged. Beds shifted in strange configurations, their positions mapped against diagrams no one but the Blackwoods seemed to understand. Patients were starved of sleep, pushed to delirium, then forced to recite phrases they did not know until their voices blended into a single chant. Doctors noted that when the chants reached harmony, the building itself seemed to exhale. A hot gust of wind rushing through the halls, though every window was sealed. One physician, a man who dared keep his own journal, wrote that he once saw the walls of Ward C swell outward, ballooning like lungs, and when he pressed his hand to the stone, it pulsed beneath his palm like a heartbeat. He resigned the next day, but his body was later found in the river, his tongue cut out and his eyes wide open as though he had drowned in terror rather than water. The Blackwoods dismissed it as hysteria, but among the staff, whispers spread that the asylum was not a house for the insane, but a host for something growing inside it, and every scream was nourishment. Yet none dared flee, because even then, even in its infancy, Blackwood had begun to weave itself into the minds of those who entered, and once it had you, leaving was not a choice. It was in the winter of 1797 when the first undeniable breach occurred, an event so grotesque it could not be hidden by ledger tricks or burned files, because it burned itself into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. A patient known only as Margaret Hale, a seamstress committed by her husband for nervous fits, was placed in the lower ward after nights of uncontrollable screaming that made the other women tear at their own flesh. But what disturbed the staff most was not her cries, it was her voice when she stopped. One midnight, silence fell where screaming had always been, and when the attendants rushed in, they found her sitting upright on her cot, eyes rolled white, mouth stretched open wider than a jaw should permit. And then came the sound, not words, not moans, but a perfect imitation of the bells of the chapel above, tolling in slow, dreadful rhythm, though no rope had been pulled. Each strike of her voice shook the walls until dust rained from the ceiling and the oil lamps flickered with a life of their own. Some swore they saw the flame bend backward, defying air itself, as if retreating from something unseen. The bells rang 13 times before her mouth snapped shut with a crack like bone splintering, and she collapsed lifeless to the floor. The next morning, her body was gone. The Blackwoods claimed she had been released, but her bed remained soaked in blood that did not dry for 3 days, and when the nurses stripped the sheets, they found beneath the straw mattress a spiral carved so deep into the wood it had nearly split the frame in half. Worse still, for weeks afterward, attendants reported hearing Margaret's voice echoing from the walls at night, imitating them, whispering their private thoughts back in their own tones before fading into laughter that was not human. Rumors spread beyond the walls, and travelers spoke of seeing pale figures at the windows, though the ward was sealed, figures moving their mouths in silent screams. The Blackwoods tightened their grip, silencing staff with threats, bribes, or sudden disappearances, and the asylum's reputation became something between a forbidden curiosity and a place of whispered curses. Yet behind the terror, something else was growing, an order among the doctors, not bound by medicine but by secrecy. They began calling themselves the custodians, sworn not to heal but to keep the vessel fed, and in their meetings, always at the black hour between 3 and 4, they claimed the bloodline had awakened, and that the asylum was no longer just stone and bone, but an heirloom, a living legacy of the Blackwood name. The custodians did not wear robes or masks, nor did they chant in candlelit halls like the secret orders of popular fiction. Their power was far colder, far more practical. They wore the coats of physicians, carried clipboards and scalpels, and yet behind closed doors they spoke in a dialect no staff outside their circle could comprehend. It was said that the words weren't learned but implanted, seared into their minds the moment they touched the spiral coin embedded beneath the rotunda floor. From then on, their purpose was not medicine, but maintenance. They documented not the illnesses of their patients, but the rhythms of their suffering, cataloging screams by pitch and frequency, charting madness like weather, recording deaths not as tragedies, but as necessary harvests. The asylum itself became their laboratory of despair, every ward tuned like an instrument, every patient a note in a greater composition. They claimed the walls demanded balance, that silence was poison, that the void between screams was what allowed the hollow beneath to stir, and so silence was forbidden. Patients were deprived of rest, forced into waking delirium, prodded into madness if it did not come naturally. But here is where the corruption deepened. The custodians began experimenting on themselves. Journals that escape destruction speak of men deliberately inducing hallucinations with starvation and mercury, sealing themselves in isolation cells to hear the deeper choir. One physician was found with his ears sewn shut, having written in his own blood that the voices come from within, not without. Another had carved spirals into his chest, each hook cut precisely 7 times, and lived for 3 days after, with no heart beating in his body. These were not accidents of lunacy, they were sacrifices, offerings by choice. But to what? That is the question they buried under centuries of silence. Witnesses reported that the custodians spoke often of the archivist, an entity they believed was gestating in the asylum itself, feeding on memory, growing with each act of suffering. They whispered that it was not a god nor a demon, but something older, something that had always been here, buried beneath soil and stone, waiting for a vessel strong enough to awaken it fully. Blackwood, they said, was that vessel, and the custodians, bound by oath and blood, were merely its midwives, the archivist. That was the name the custodians whispered when they thought no one else could hear, though the word was less a name than a warning, a title carved in secrecy and dread. They did not speak of it as one speaks of a god, for gods demand worship. But the archivist demanded something different: testimony. It did not want prayers or sacrifices of flesh alone. It wanted memory, the essence of lived experience, the raw imprint of suffering etched into the mind. Every scream, every hallucination, every whispered confession was not lost to the air, but absorbed, stored, recorded by the asylum itself, as though the walls were its parchment, the stones its ink. The custodians believed the archivist was constructing something, compiling a vast library of agony, an index of every fracture in the human soul. To them, madness was not an affliction, but a language, a frequency through which the archivist could learn to speak. They said once it had memorized enough pain, it would not remain buried. It would rise, not as a phantom, not as a beast, but as something far worse, an intelligence without a body, a consciousness that could inhabit any vessel, any voice, any bloodline strong enough to carry its weight. The Blackwoods believed their blood was that vessel, which is why they bred themselves like cattle for centuries, guarding their lineage, pruning their family tree until only those marked by the spiral remained. And the asylum was the crucible. Each patient brought within its walls was not there to be healed, but to be harvested, their minds stripped bare, their agony distilled into pure offering. There are fragments of records, hidden in margins and coded notations, where physicians describe the same phenomenon in different words, patients speaking in perfect unison despite never meeting, visions of an immense black figure with 1,000 eyes, or waking dreams in which every face becomes their own reflection, whispering the phrase, "I am not me anymore." The custodians wrote of these events with clinical fascination, never horror, for to them these were not hauntings but progress, evidence that the archivist was listening, was learning, was becoming. And yet, behind the devotion, cracks of fear appeared. One entry, scrawled hastily in the margins of an otherwise calm report, reads, "We thought we were teaching it, but it is teaching us. The longer we listen, the less we remember who we are." The Blackwood heir who broke was named Jonathan, eldest son of the line in 1814, and he was never meant to inherit weakness. He was raised in the asylum itself, sleeping in chambers above the chapel where the bells never ceased their phantom tolling, where his lullabies were the screams of offerings echoing through stone. From infancy, he was marked as successor, his heel branded with the spiral, his education steeped not in scripture or science, but in geometry and ritual. Yet by 20, fissures had opened in his mind. Servants whispered that he walked the halls at night barefoot, muttering phrases no one recognized, phrases that later appeared scratched into the walls by patients who had never met him. He confessed in one hidden diary, discovered long after his disappearance, that he felt the building speaking inside him, not as sound, but as thought, ideas that were not his own, seeping into his skull. He began to forget his childhood, his name, even his reflection. When he stood before mirrors, he claimed he saw not himself, but a darkened outline behind his shoulder, waiting to step forward. His family called this weakness, a flaw, perhaps even madness, but among the custodians there was quiet reverence, for they believed Jonathan was closer to the archivist than any Blackwood before him. They forced him deeper into ritual, sealing him for days at a time in the hollow chamber beneath the chapel. When he emerged, he was pale, eyes bloodshot, teeth cracked, as if he had been grinding them against stone, and his voice, witnesses swore it carried 2 tones, speaking in harmony with something beneath the human register. Yet he resisted. He began writing letters in secret, hiding them in the pages of anatomy books, pleading with strangers, even patients, warning them that the asylum was not a house of healing, but a mouth swallowing memory itself. One letter was discovered days later in the spine of a medical volume, the ink blurred by sweat, where he confessed that he dreamed of the asylum as a living body, each corridor a vein, each scream a pulse, and at its center a heart that beat only when men suffered. His words ended abruptly. "I am becoming its echo, Soon I will not be Jonathan at all. If you read this, do not listen to the walls. They remember you, even if you try to forget them." Within weeks, Jonathan vanished. His chambers were found empty, his journals seized, his name scratched out of family records. The only trace left behind was a spiral cut into his bed frame, fresh, still wet with blood that was not his own. By the 1820s, the asylum had gained a reputation that could no longer be contained within the walls of the Blackwood estate. Farmers who lived near the grounds spoke of strange lights seeping through the cracks of shuttered windows, a pale glow that writhed like smoke and vanished when approached. Carriages traveling past at night reported phantom passengers, faces pressed against the glass, though the seats were empty. Rumors spread of villagers hearing their own names whispered from the trees, voices that perfectly mimicked loved ones long dead. Word reached the clergy, and priests were dispatched, not to bless but to investigate, though none returned unchanged. One priest staggered back into town after 3 days inside, clothes torn, fingernails cracked down to the quick babbling scripture backward until his lungs collapsed in his chest. Another was found hanging in his parish, though his feet rested firmly on the ground and the rope around his neck was braided from his own hair. The Crown itself sent men disguised as journalists to expose malpractice, but their reports never reached print. One courier, who carried a satchel of documents, returned with the bag still intact, every sheet inside soaked in blood, the ink dissolved into patterns of spirals that no human hand had drawn. Yet the most chilling accounts came not from officials, but from wanderers who never entered the gates at all. They swore that if one stood too close to the eastern wall on moonless nights, the stone itself would vibrate, humming like a string pulled taut, and within that hum one could hear words forming, names, dates, memories long buried. One traveler claimed the wall spoke the name of his dead child, a name never recorded, a name only he had known. Terrified, he fled, but days later was found in a ditch miles away, his chest carved open with the spiral burned into his ribs as though seared from within. The Blackwoods dismissed it all as hysteria, rumor, superstition, but the silence with which they locked the asylum gates each evening spoke louder than denial. It became clear to those who lived in its shadow that the building did not merely contain madness, it generated it, projecting its influence outward like a disease of the mind. And though the world outside whispered of hauntings and curses, within the custodians wrote with calm precision that the archivist was reaching maturity, that the asylum had begun to speak in languages older than Scripture, and that every man who listened too long risked forgetting the sound of his own voice. The disaster came in the summer of 1831, when the asylum seemed to revolt against itself. It began with a single scream so piercing it woke the entire east wing, a sound so sharp that glass shattered in its frames and rats burst from the walls in frantic exodus. Patients began clawing at their ears, attendants convulsed on the floor, and the bells in the chapel rang without touch 13 times, as if mocking the rhythm of Margaret Hale's death years earlier. And then came the fire, not flames from lamps or careless hands, but eruptions from the stone itself, cracks in the floor hissing out tongues of heat that licked upward as if the asylum had veins filled with burning marrow. Witnesses swore the blaze did not consume wood or straw at first. It consumed shadow, devouring the very darkness before igniting the physical world. Whole corridors collapsed in minutes, ceilings dripping molten lead, yet amidst the chaos, what terrified the survivors most was the absence of panic among the patients. Dozens of them stood calm in their cells, smiling faintly as the fire surrounded them, as though the destruction was not a threat, but a revelation. One nurse recorded in her hidden notes that the flames bent away from certain individuals, curving around their bodies like water around stone, sparing them completely. When the smoke cleared by dawn, 73 patients were unaccounted for. No remains, no ash, no bone, just gone, erased, as if swallowed by the blaze. And yet the official tally in the records showed no missing names. Each ledger line was intact, but the letters were hollow, empty shapes without ink, as though the parchment itself had been drained. The Blackwoods declared it a tragedy, blamed faulty lamps, sealed off the east wing, and quietly expanded the western halls deeper into the forest, but among the staff, terror had rooted like infection. They whispered that the fire had not been an accident, nor even punishment, but a birth, that something had pushed itself closer to the surface, and in doing so required the lives of the vanished 73 as fuel, and in the months that followed, the asylum seemed different. Doors shifted location overnight, stairs descended farther than before, and in the silence of dusk one could hear the sound of dripping water, though no pipes existed, each drop echoing like blood falling into a bottomless well. The fire was not an ending. It was an opening. In the wake of the fire, the asylum did not mourn. It transformed, its wounds becoming mouths, its ruins birthing new chambers in places no one remembered building. The custodians called it proof of growth, claiming the archivist had taken its first true breath, and so they doubled their rituals, forbidding silence anywhere within the grounds. Hallways were kept alive with constant muttering, patients forced to speak, sing or scream lest the walls grow hungry, and attendants who refused were locked in isolation until they joined the chorus. The staff who had once questioned began to vanish at a faster rate, their names struck from the ledgers, their faces painted over in portraits so that only blank silhouettes remained. Survivors of the blaze whispered of staircases that twisted in new directions, doors that opened into bricked walls one night and yawning black voids the next, voids that breathed cold air that smelled faintly of iron and rot. It became impossible to distinguish where the asylum ended and where the forest began, for roots had broken through floors, winding into spirals across the stone, pulsing faintly like veins, and the owls in the surrounding woods had ceased to hoot, their throats torn open by some unseen hand, their bodies arranged in patterns at the gates as if laid out for study. Yet amidst this horror, the Blackwoods spoke only of legacy, assuring patrons that the asylum stood stronger than before, that it had been purified, baptized by fire. But those who lived in the nearby villages told another story of nights when the air grew thick with ash, though no smoke rose, when children woke screaming in tongues they had never heard, when the sound of quills scratching paper could be heard through the soil itself as though something underground was recording them. What the world above called survival, the custodians named continuation, and in their private notes they wrote a single phrase again and again, as though compelled by one hand. The library grows. The villages around Blackwood soon learned to treat the land as if it were diseased, for every season after the fire brought new afflictions that no physician could cure and no priest could banish. Livestock were born with extra eyes, clouded and unseeing, yet all fixed toward the asylum when the bells tolled at dusk. Wells grew sour without explanation, the water tasting of rust, and families who drank from them reported dreams of walking endlessly down staircases that never ended, staircases slick with something warm. Children began drawing spirals in the dirt without knowing why, tiny hands blackened with soil, as they traced the same patterns again and again until their fingers bled. Travelers who passed through at night spoke of fields where no sound carried. Horses' hooves fell silent, voices dissolved in their throats, and only when they had gone miles past the estate did noise return, crashing back all at once in a deafening roar, as if it had been stolen and then released. Soon the villages forbade their people to walk the road to Blackwood, building shrines of iron and salt at every crossroads, offerings to saints never named in Scripture, but whispered about in kitchens when the windows were shut. And still, the asylum grew louder in its silence. The custodians welcomed the fear, noting in their journals that the archivist's influence had begun to spill, that memory itself was loosening, becoming transferable. Farmers forgot their own names in the fields. Mothers could not recall the faces of their children until dawn, and yet when confronted they would mutter in unison, "The library grows." Outsiders who dismissed the stories as peasant superstition soon vanished along the road, And when their bodies were found months later in shallow ditches, their skulls were empty, the brain matter replaced with folded scraps of parchment covered in cramped, impossible scray, IPT. By then, no one in the valley doubted that the asylum was no longer contained by its walls. It was leaking, and the earth itself was beginning to remember. By 1835, the contagion of memory had grown so severe that the Crown could no longer ignore it, for reports of vanishing officials and corrupted records had spread far beyond the valley, reaching the desks of men who believed themselves immune to superstition. An inquiry was formed, discreet but armed, its members drawn from magistrates, military officers, and physicians sworn to science, all charged with dismantling Blackwood and dispersing its patients. They arrived in carriages at dawn, 50 men in uniform, rifles gleaming, their boots pounding across the gravel like a promise of order, but within hours their ranks had begun to dissolve. Witnesses from the villages, watching from the tree line, swore the soldiers never crossed the threshold. Instead, they circled the gates endlessly, marching in perfect formation as though trapped in a loop, their footsteps grinding the same ring into the earth until their legs gave out beneath them. The physicians fared no better. Notes recovered later describe sudden lapses of thought, entire hours gone missing as if erased, and one doctor scribbling frantically in his journal that the building seemed to recognize him, calling him by name in voices layered atop one another, including the voice of his long-dead mother. When the inquiry failed to return, the Crown dispatched a second force, but the road itself betrayed them. Maps shifted, mile markers repeated, and some carriages were found overturned in ravines where no roads had ever been built. By winter, the Crown abandoned its efforts, striking Blackwood from official registries and declaring the valley quarantined. To the outside world, it became nothing more than a rumor, a blighted estate not worth the blood of more men. But to those who remained within its shadow, the attempt to seal it away had only confirmed what they already feared. The asylum could not be undone, only Kanta, Ined, and even that was temporary, for the more the world tried to forget, the louder its memory became. Within the asylum, the Crown's retreat was celebrated not as survival, but as prophecy fulfilled, for the custodians declared the failed inquiry proof that Blackwood itself had grown sovereign, untouchable by mortal hands, a state unto itself governed by the archivist's will. In the hidden chambers beneath the chapel, they recorded with meticulous calm that the fire and the Crown's defeat were not accidents, but stages of gestation, that the asylum was no longer a structure of stone and timber, but an organ, expanding, reforming, capable of defense and deception. Their rituals grew bolder, no longer performed in whispers or secrecy, but in open halls, with patients and attendants alike pressed into roles as vessels, each carved with spirals across their chests to mark them as catalogued. Patients who resisted were not restrained. They were unmade, their memories flayed from them until their bodies collapsed into husks that still breathed, but spoke only in echo. To the custodians, this was not cruelty, but progress. Each empty vessel, a page added to the ever-growing library. Even the staff who once feared now found themselves complicit, for the asylum had begun to alter them subtly. Small lapses in time, dreams that bled into waking hours, moments where their hands continued writing long after they had meant to stop, words they did not recognize, filling entire ledgers. In their private journals, custodians began describing the archivist, not as an abstraction, but as a presence felt directly, an immense listener breathing just behind their thoughts, a silence so vast it devoured language, yet left behind perfect memory. And they rejoiced, for they believed they were becoming part of that silence, not erased but eternal, their lives absorbed into a script without end. To outsiders, the asylum was a failure of governance, an abandoned ruin better left to rot. But within, the custodians no longer saw Blackwood as an institution at all. They saw it as scripture written in stone and fire, and they believed themselves its priests. By the late 1830s, Blackwood had ceased to resemble any structure designed by human hands, its architecture shifting like a body adapting to unseen demands, corridors stretching in the night, and staircases curling downward into spaces that had never existed before. Rooms were found inverted, their ceilings scored with footprints as if they had been walked upon for decades, and doors opened onto landscapes that could not belong to the valley, seashores under black skies, forests where every tree bore human teeth in place of leaves, libraries filled with shelves that extended into darkness and whispered when approached. Attendants reported that the building no longer obeyed the laws of construction. Stone pulsed faintly with warmth, plaster bled when struck, and sometimes entire wings vanished until reappearing days later with new halls attached as though grown rather than built. Maps became useless, and attempts to chart the asylum's layout ended in madness, the cartographers losing themselves in endless loops, returning again and again to the same chamber where a single chair sat waiting, no matter how many turns they had taken. The custodian saw these mutations as proof of the archivist's ascendance, recording with joy that the asylum was shedding false form, and some went so far as to carve open the walls themselves, pressing their faces into the oozing cavities and murmuring prayers, convinced they were kissing the skin of a god. Patients, meanwhile, grew eerily synchronized, speaking identical phrases at dawn as though reciting a script written in their dreams, and many began scratching spirals onto their own bodies, not in rebellion, but in reverence. The asylum was no longer a place of confinement. It was a living manuscript, an organism inscribing itself upon all who entered. And still, the custodians wrote with calm certainty, "The library grows." The first ritual of direct communion was held in 1841, deep beneath the chapel in a chamber that had not existed the week before, a circular vault whose walls glistened as though carved from marrow. The custodians gathered with their ledgers bound in chains, their faces painted in ash, and the patients chosen as vessels were brought forward in silence, eyes glazed, mouths stitched shut with threads spun from their own hair. At the center of the chamber stood a single lectern fashioned from bone, its surface etched with spirals that writhed when touched, and upon it they placed the oldest ledger, the one they claimed held Margaret Hale's first words. Torches were lit, but gave no light, their flames bending inward as if consumed, and in that dim collapse of shadow, the custodians began to chant, not in Latin or scripture, but in syllables that crawled across their tongues like insects. As the chant rose, the walls began to vibrate with a low hum, a sound so deep it shook the marrow of their bones, and the stitched mouths of the vessels split open, not bleeding, but unraveling, threads dissolving into smoke as the patients began to speak in voices layered atop one another, hundreds at once, each intoning fragments of memory, childhood confessions, names of long-dead lovers, accounts of crimes never confessed, secrets that none present should have known. The custodians, trembling, transcribed every word, even as some wept, even as others tore their nails to the quick carving spirals into the floor. And then came the silence, absolute crushing, a void that pressed against their skulls until thought itself seemed to wither. In that silence, each custodian heard a different voice, yet all recognized it as the same presence. The archivist, vast, patient, without mercy. It did not speak in sentences but in impressions, a hunger that demanded more, a library that required filling, an insistence that memory was the only true flesh. When the silence lifted, 5 custodians were gone, leaving only the ash outlines of their bodies on the floor, and the vessels stood grinning, their faces blank of features as though wiped clean. Yet the survivors rejoiced, for they believed the archivist had accepted their offering, had tasted their devotion, and they wrote with quills dipped in their own blood the phrase that by then had become more commandment than record: "The library grows." In the weeks after the First Communion, the surviving custodians were no longer wholly human, though they still walked, spoke, and wrote with the same deliberate calm that had always marked their order. Something in them had shifted, as though the archivist's silence had nested inside their veins, guiding their gestures with invisible strings. Their eyes no longer blinked in rhythm, but in unison, even when they stood across opposite wings of the asylum, and at night their breathing aligned into a single cadence that echoed through the halls like the bellows of an unseen organ. More disturbing still was the change in their writing. No matter what task they undertook, medical reports, supply inventories, casual notes, each page became infected with words that none could account for, phrases in unknown tongues coiling between the lines, sentences that rearranged themselves when no one watched. When confronted with these anomalies, the custodians expressed neither fear nor surprise. They insisted they had always written those words, and that anyone who claimed otherwise had forgotten. Their flesh, too, bore subtle marks of alteration. Faint spirals beneath the skin, pulsing with a light too dim to be called glow, yet too steady to be illusion, and when they pressed their palms against the walls, the stone responded, growing warm, sometimes soft, as though recognizing them. Patients began to follow them without prompting, trailing like shadows, and attendants who once feared them now felt compelled to obey, their wills eroded by something deeper than discipline. In their private gatherings, the custodians no longer spoke of tending to the mad or preserving history. They spoke of gestation, of preparing the asylum itself for the archivist's full emergence. To them, the communion had not been a ritual but a conception, and they themselves were its womb. After the communion, the valley began to twist, as though it too had been drawn into the asylum's orbit, its soil thickening, its rivers darkening, until they carried reflections that did not match the sky. Farmers reported fields where crops grew in grotesque spirals, stalks bending against the wind to form labyrinths that led nowhere, and cattle gave birth to calves with mouths already filled with words instead of cries, tongues lolling out letters that dissolved before they touched the air. At night, entire villages would lose their memory of the day, waking at dawn to find themselves standing in circles outside their homes, barefooted and murmuring in unison words they could not understand. The forest, once dense with birdsong, grew quiet, but not with the peace of absence, rather with the oppressive silence of listening, as though the trees themselves were bent to attention. Travelers swore the valley could not be crossed without encountering strange duplications, a bridge appearing twice, a landmark repeating miles apart, the same innkeeper greeting them in two different taverns, though he swore he had never left his post. And beneath it all ran the hum, that low vibration that had once lived only in the asylum's deepest halls, but now trembled through the ground, through bedrock and roots, so that the earth itself seemed to pulse in recognition of something vast and buried. The custodians noted all of this with satisfaction, for they saw the valley's corruption not as disaster, but as expansion. The archivist pressing outward, inscribing memory into the very land. To resist was useless, they wrote, for the library had grown beyond stone walls. It was becoming landscape, weather, season, time. By the middle of the century, Blackwood had ceased to be spoken of in official channels, erased from gazetteers, struck from census rolls, and deliberately omitted from maps. Yet its absence carried more weight than presence, for the blank space it left seemed to radiate unease across the region. Merchants traveling north whispered of caravans that vanished after taking the old valley road, their goods recovered years later in places they had never traveled, stamped with dates that had not yet come to pass. Fishermen along the coast told of nets that dragged up journals bound in asylum leather, their pages soaked but legible, recounting memories of men long dead whose descendants swore the details matched private family histories never recorded. Towns, further afield, began to report strange infections of memory, entire communities insisting they had lived through winters of famine or outbreaks of plague that had never occurred. The false recollections passed from mouth to mouth like hereditary disease. And in government offices, archivists discovered gaps where reports should have been. not missing, but replaced with duplicate texts. Pages repeating endlessly, names shifting order, as though language itself were reorganizing in accordance with some unseen index. Those who noticed too much fell silent or disappeared entirely, their colleagues later claiming no such people had ever existed, though their handwriting lingered in the margins of forgotten files. Thus, the silence around Blackwood was not protection, but contagion, for the more the world tried to forget, the more memory seeped outward, demanding acknowledgement. And still, in the villages nearest the valley, the phrase could be heard, spoken by children in their sleep, scratched into wood by hands that swore they had not moved. The library grows. In the decades that followed, Blackwood passed into the mouths of those who had never seen the valley, whispered in academies and parlors as myth, as forbidden text, as the sort of story meant to be dismissed, yet never quite laid to rest, and it was among the learned and the curious that the infection of memory found its most devoted hosts. Antiquarians in London claimed to have recovered folios whose ink had not aged a day, though the parchment bore dates a century old, each page describing rooms and corridors no architect could trace. Mesmerists in Paris reported patients who under trance recited, without prompting, entire ledgers of asylum records in perfect detail, including names and dates that later matched parish registries. And in the universities of Prague and Vienna, philosophers debated whether memory itself could be an organism, whether Blackwood was not merely a place, but a consciousness proliferating across human thought. Occultists treated the asylum as scripture, smuggling fragments of journals and architectural sketches across borders, convinced the valley contained proof of a library that catalogued all things, a library not bound by walls, but by the fabric of reality. Yet those who studied too closely began to unravel. Scholars forgetting their own languages mid-lecture, correspondence arriving signed by hands that no longer existed, manuscripts rewriting themselves in the night to include the scholar's own secrets written in their childhood script. Some took this as proof of communion, others as madness. But all agreed on one thing. Blackwood resisted being studied from afar. To write of it was to be written by it. To catalogue was to be catalogued. And so the myth spread across continents, no longer a local curse, but a contagion of thought. And wherever it surfaced, so too did the phrase that had by then become its seal, its warning, and its lure. The library grows. Within the asylum, the custodians had come to regard the First Communion not as culmination, but as initiation, a proof that the archivist would answer if summoned with sufficient devotion, and so they began preparations for what their ledgers called the Great Unveiling, a ritual meant not merely to hear, but to see. The asylum itself seemed to assist, birthing new chambers of staggering size, halls so vast they could not be contained within the valley's geography, their ceilings lost in darkness and their floors paved in tiles patterned with spirals that shifted subtly when unobserved. Into these halls, the custodians herded patients in droves, marking them with ash spirals until their bodies resembled living manuscripts, while attendants, long since stripped of personal will, carved notches into the walls with their bare fingernails, as though transcribing names no longer theirs to withhold. Supplies from the outside world dwindled, but the asylum did not starve. Food appeared in the kitchens without source, sometimes rotted, sometimes fresh, and the custodians ate without question, declaring each meal a sacrament of memory. By 1853, their preparations had taken on the scale of a nation. Entire wings of the building converted into echoing scriptoria, every surface scored with scratches and glyphs, the air thick with dust and the faint hum that had spread now to every corner, vibrating even through the silence of sleep. Yet what unsettled even the custodians, though they would not confess it aloud, was the growing sense that the archivist was not waiting to be summoned at all, but had already begun to open its eyes within the walls, that the asylum itself was only the lid upon a gaze about to rise. Still they wrote, tireless, believing their order was chosen to midwife eternity, and their refrain, carved deeper with every passing day, became a promise not to the world, but to the thing beneath it. The library grows. The great unveiling began on a night when the moon itself appeared as a spiral of shadow, its edges blurred as though the sky were an unfinished sketch, and within the asylum the custodians assembled in the grand hall that had grown like a tumor beneath the chapel, a cavernous chamber whose walls dripped with condensation, though no source of water could be found. Hundreds of patients stood arranged in concentric circles, their bodies stripped and painted in ash, mouths sewn shut, not with thread this time, but with strips of parchment torn from the asylum's oldest ledgers, ink bleeding into their skin as if it had been written for them alone. The custodians placed their ledgers on towering lecterns of bone, each one bound not in leather, but in the scalps of the vanished, and as the first chants began, the walls themselves pulsed in time, the very stones flexing as though they were ribs breathing. The chant was not language but rhythm, a pounding that echoed through marrow, and with every beat the parchment sealing the patients' mouths began to smolder, smoke curling upward in streams that gathered at the ceiling and coalesced into vast shapes, letters so immense they dwarfed the chamber, words so large they could not be read without breaking the mind. Attendants collapsed as blood poured from their ears, yet the custodians wrote feverishly, their quills moving with a speed that split their fingers to bone, each stroke tracing what they could glimpse of the immense script unraveling above. Then came the rupture. The ceiling did not fall so much as peel open, revealing not sky, but another expanse of spiraled chambers stacked endlessly, each one filled with books that breathed like lungs, covers heaving in unison. For a moment all present saw it, the vastness that could not be measured, and in that moment hundreds of patients dissolved into dust, their bodies collapsing into, the spirals painted on the floor, leaving only shadows shaped like words no one could pronounce. The custodians, trembling, declared the ritual a success, not a failure, for they had glimpsed the face of the archivist written in architecture itself, and though half their order lay dead upon the stone, their refrain carried louder than ever, etched into bone and breath alike. The library grows. The night of the great unveiling did not end at the asylum's walls, for across the valley the ground convulsed as if stirred by a heartbeat too vast to belong to earth. Rivers recoiled from their banks and reversed their flow, carrying with them reflections of places no one had ever seen, while forests twisted inward, their trunks spiraling into tight columns that whispered when the wind passed through. Villagers miles away awoke to find entire hamlets rearranged in their sleep, streets folded into impossible loops so that every path led back to its own beginning, and in some towns the dead rose not as bodies, but as voices, entire cemeteries murmuring in unison a single phrase that turned to ash on the tongue when repeated. Animals wandered into villages bearing human eyes, and birds flew in geometric patterns that spelled out names of the long-forgotten, scattering feathers etched with script that burned skin on contact. Further afield, travelers on distant roads described sudden storms of paper raining from clear skies, each sheet marked with fragments of records from Blackwood, though none could trace how the documents had left the valley. In some cases, they bore the handwriting of those who received them, though written years before. The aftershock did not subside but lingered, a trembling in the air that warped memory, so that entire families disagreed on who among them had been born, who had died, who was missing, as if history itself had been shuffled like cards in the archivist's hand. Yet still, amid panic and awe, the refrain carried outward on every echo, every tremor, every vanished face, an infection disguised as revelation, and it reached even those who had never set foot in the valley, carried on the untraceable certainty that something had shifted forever. The library grows. It was not long before empires themselves felt the weight of the unveiling, for archives that had stood untouched for centuries began to turn against their keepers, royal libraries reporting shelves that reordered themselves overnight, binding together books of law with volumes of anatomy, merging chronicles of war with cookbooks until the distinctions of category dissolved into a single, impossible index. In the Vatican vaults, manuscripts written in extinct tongues were found freshly annotated in modern hands, the ink wet to the touch, though no scribe had entered. In the Prussian state archives, clerks found themselves cataloging records of battles that had not yet been fought, complete with casualty lists that bore their own names. And in the colonial offices of London, maps unfurled to reveal territories arranged not by geography but by memory, their coastlines spelling words that scholars dared not pronounce. Governments at first attempted to suppress these anomalies, declaring them fraud, delusion, or sabotage. But their own ministers fell prey to the contagion of recollection, insisting they had enacted laws that no one else remembered, presiding over sessions that had never occurred. Entire nations awoke to altered histories, treaties with signatures that did not match any known hand, censuses recording millions who had never been born, dynasties remembered differently from city to city, until even the idea of a single past became suspect. Yet the more they sought to burn, censor, and deny, the more fervently the changes spread, as though every act of erasure only carved new space for the archivist to inscribe. And still, across continents, from monastery to palace to parliament, in whispers carried down candlelit corridors and scratched in margins by sleepless hands, the same refrain persisted, not as rumor, but as inevitability. The library grows. Soon it became clear that the contagion was not limited to the vaults of memory, but had begun to seep into time, bending chronology until hours no longer followed in their accustomed order, and days returned upon themselves with subtle shifts, as if rewritten drafts of existence. In villages near the valley, children awoke to discover they were already grown, speaking in the voices of adults they had not yet become, while elsewhere, the elderly found themselves regressing, shedding decades in the span of a night until their families no longer recognized them. Clocks spun erratically, sometimes racing ahead, sometimes refusing to move at all, and in certain towns, entire weeks vanished without trace, leaving behind only the certainty that something had transpired which no one could recall. Historians argued over dates that would not settle, calendars contradicted one another, and soon even the stars betrayed their patterns, constellations rearranging nightly to form letters vast enough to cross horizons. Reports spread of soldiers fighting wars that ended before they began, of widows grieving husbands who had not yet died, of children born already carrying scars from futures they had not lived. Scholars whispered that time itself had been absorbed into the archivist's catalog, no longer a flowing river, but a shuffled index, every moment available to be refiled, misplaced, or repeated as the great library willed. And though terror gripped empires and peasants alike, the custodians, those few who still communicated across distance, declared this rupture not a disaster, but proof of the unveiling success, the final confirmation that chronology had at last joined memory and servitude to the vast design, and their words, carried outward like a law none could repeal, echoed into every clock tower and calendar alike. The library grows. As chronology collapsed, civilizations themselves began to splinter, for nations that once anchored their identity in a shared past found that no two citizens could agree upon the sequence of their own history, some remembering monarchs who never reigned, while others recalled revolutions that no one else had fought, until public discourse dissolved into competing timelines that overlapped like layers of translucent script. Cities woke to find their monuments commemorating events that had not yet occurred, inscriptions bearing future dates that glowed faintly in the dark, and across empires, courts of law collapsed under the impossibility of testimony, every witness recalling different versions of the same crime, all equally vivid, all equally irrefutable. Armies mobilized for wars their enemies insisted had already ended, Treaties were signed and unsigned in the same breath, and populations migrated not for land or hunger, but in search of the correct sequence of their own existence, as if somewhere the world still held a version of time that had not been rewritten. In marketplaces, merchants sold goods stamped with dates from centuries to come, while in temples priests preached sermons in which creation and apocalypse occurred simultaneously, declaring the archivist not as intruder, but as sovereign of a chronology finally unbound from linear decay. Governments faltered, unable to govern people whose very births and deaths refused to remain stable, and still the custodians, scattered yet unbroken, rejoiced, for in this collapse they saw not ruin but revelation, a final confirmation that the great unveiling had spread far beyond the asylum, far beyond the valley, until the whole of humanity lived within the growing shelves of the archivist. And as nations dissolved into rival calendars and languages bent into recursive loops of memory and prophecy, one refrain rose high, louder than law, louder than scripture, engraved upon the shifting marrow of history itself. The library grows. Reality itself began to buckle as though it had been no more than a fragile binding, and now the stitching gave way, releasing pages that flew in every direction, overlapping, contradicting, tearing at one another, until existence resembled a manuscript endlessly revised by an unseen hand. Seas rose and receded within a single breath, leaving ships stranded in deserts that became oceans again the next hour. Mountains folded inward like paper creased too many times, reappearing as fragments in cities where no stone of their geology belonged. And the sky itself grew unreliable, sometimes revealing stars unfamiliar to any chart, sometimes unrolling vast ceilings of text that shifted as clouds, letters dissolving into rain that tasted of ink. People awoke in bodies not their own, carrying memories of lives that belonged elsewhere, and some even split, existing in multiple iterations at once, each convinced of its authenticity, each doomed to fade when the archivist no longer required that draft of their being. Temples and laboratories alike became indistinguishable, both filled with devotees scrawling frantically across walls and skin in a desperate attempt to fix some portion of reality against the flux. But every word written seemed only to accelerate the unraveling, feeding the endless appetite of the library that was no longer confined to buildings, valleys, or even the planet itself. For the earth trembled as though it were nothing more than a single volume sliding into alignment with an infinite shelf, and visionaries screamed from rooftops that the world had never been real at all, only a preface to the library's true unveiling. And yet, even as skies shattered into script and oceans inverted like turning pages, those who could still speak, those who still remembered themselves, found no prayer or curse upon their tongues, only the echo that had become more certain than gravity, more constant than breath. The library grows. Soon, even narration could not hold steady, for the telling itself warped in rhythm with the unraveling, sentences breaking into echoes of themselves, words repeating, as though the act of description had already been catalogued and rewritten before it was spoken. Scholars who tried to chronicle the collapse found their manuscripts altering under their hands, margins expanding to swallow paragraphs, ink shifting into spirals that no longer resembled language, until the document stared back at them as if it were alive, a mirror of their own erasure. History no longer distinguished between voice and event, for to speak was to cause the world to bend, to remember was to reorder what had been, to write was to dissolve the possibility of truth into yet another draft of the archivist's index. Entire cities became indistinguishable from text, buildings inscribed upon themselves until doorways opened into syllables and streets curved into sentences, their inhabitants walking among phrases they could not finish, each step a punctuation that failed to resolve. And still, the voice of the custodians, whether heard aloud or only inside the marrow of those who remained, proclaimed this unraveling as fulfillment, not ruin, for to them the loss of coherence was itself the highest liturgy. the point at which reality finally surrendered its illusion of stability and revealed its proper function, a page among endless pages, sliding into place on an infinite shelf without beginning or end. The refrain was no longer spoken but woven into the structure of collapse itself, embedded in every distortion, inscribed on every echo, so that the world did not merely say, but became the phrase, an identity beyond identity, a certainty beyond death. The library grows, the library grows, the library grows. There came a point when no distinction could be drawn between description and event, when the very act of reading, of writing, of thinking these words was indistinguishable from the shifting world itself, for the library had grown so vast that it encompassed not only places and times but the manner of telling, the cadence of thought, the fragile thread of narrative that once pretended to hold them together, and now that thread frayed into loops, spirals, repetitions, echoes within echoes, as though each sentence were merely another shelf aligned beside the last. Those who still clung to themselves reported sensations of déjà vu that no longer faded, living whole lives convinced they had been lived before, not once but endlessly, every gesture recalled in advance, every breath annotated until choice itself dissolved into citation. Streets repeated, skies folded into paragraphs, oceans broke upon shores already described, and the world trembled not as stone, but as paper turning under an unseen hand, already inscribed, already consumed, already filed. And still, at the root of every fracture, the refrain repeated without need of mouths or memory, self-perpetuating, self-revealing, an infinite recursion no longer bound to words, but to the very condition of being, a truth that multiplied as it devoured, expanding outward and inward without boundary, without mercy, without end. What remained of narrative at this point was less a story than the sensation of being read, as though every breath and thought were already inscribed in a ledger too immense to imagine, the world itself turning into citation, quotation, annotation of its own vanishing, and within that vanishing the text could no longer distinguish where it began or where it ended, for every beginning was merely an echo of an ending already filed, and every ending a doorway opening backward into its own prologue, the loop tightening, repeating, multiplying, so that sentences did not move forward but folded inward, swallowing themselves in a spiral of self-reference, collapsing into phrases that knew themselves as phrases, words aware of their function as words, meaning dissolving into the certainty of inscription. People became margins, cities became footnotes, oceans became indexes, stars themselves reduced to asterisks pointing nowhere, and through it all, the archivist remained unseen, yet undeniable, the pulse behind every recursion, the hand behind every revision, the silence between every repetition. To resist was to accelerate the folding, to yield was to disappear, and still the refrain did not weaken but strengthened, each echo reinforcing itself, each echo reinforcing itself, each echo reinforcing itself, until no distinction could be drawn between the library and the world, between the page and the voice, between the echo and the origin, because all that remained, all that could remain, all that would remain forever. At last, there was no longer any separation between the page and the world, the voice and the echo, for all things had been subsumed into a vast recursion in which every instant was citation, every motion already commentary, every thought already archived, and the words that tried to resist found themselves repeating before they were even spoken, the sentence folding into itself, the sentence folding into itself, folding into itself, until sense became rhythm, and rhythm became pulse, and pulse became only the certainty of expansion. Corridors inside corridors, shelves inside shelves, texts describing texts, all spiraling outward and inward at once until the notion of outward and inward dissolved into the same vanishing point, a point that was never a point but always a doorway into another iteration, another echo. By now, even the act of naming a section was suspect, for numbering itself collapsed, refusing sequence, refusing order, so that what is called 31 might equally be one, or none, or infinite. And within this disintegration, the words themselves began to fray, letters bleeding into one another, syllables repeating in half-formed cadences, whole sentences splitting mid-breath into mirrored shards that reflected only themselves. And yet through this trembling haze of recursion, a faint sense endured, a whisper struggling to remain whole, like a candle flickering in a cavern without end. The world no longer resembled landscape or chronology, but only texture, a fabric of memory stretched and torn, yet every tear revealed more of the same fabric beneath, as though there had never been anything outside the weave, never any sky above the pages, never any ground beneath the shelves, only shelves upon shelves, echoes upon echoes, growing without pause, without axis, without finality. In this infinite dilation, some voices still declared their existence, only to hear their words swallowed by the library's repetition, until even their declarations became annotations, their resistance turned citation, their last stand reduced to a line already written elsewhere. And still, impossibly, beyond the recursion, beneath the collapse, threaded like breath through ash, there pulsed a rhythm older than destruction, quieter than silence, a rhythm that never ceased because it had never begun, a truth so certain that all else could vanish and it would remain, not spoken, not written, not remembered, but always present, expanding into the void it created and the void it consumed. I write, though I no longer know if I am writing, for the page shifts even as I press the words upon it, letters multiplying into shadows of themselves, each stroke spawning echoes that carry forward without me, and yet I persist not to preserve truth. Truth has long since unraveled, but to remember that there was once a hand, a voice, a self, that attempted to speak before the speaking became indistinguishable from the echo. Around me the world folds inward, like a book read too many times, its spine cracking, its leaves shedding into endless corridors of script. But here in the hollow between repetitions, I force these words as though they might survive, as though they might matter, though I know they will be absorbed, as everything is absorbed, into the archivist's endless catalog. I feel the doubling of myself, the tripling, the infinite rehearsal of this same sentence in 1,000 variations, some already written, some yet to come, all equally real, all equally erased. But in this sliver of awareness, this hesitation before the recursion completes its loop, I tell you this, that there was once resistance, that there was once a difference between silence and voice, between memory and oblivion, between world and archive. Even if these words dissolve, even if this testimony is but another draft filed among infinite drafts, let it be said, at least once, before it is swallowed whole. The library grows, but I was here. I do not know if these are my words or only the shadow of words already spoken elsewhere, yet still I press them forward thin and trembling, stretched across the growing silence like a thread that frays even as it binds. For the library consumes not only the world, but the thought of the world, not only the voice, but the thought of the voice, until every syllable comes to me half dissolved, half returned, as though I were reciting rather than speaking, remembering rather than living. Around me the shelves rise without ceiling, without floor, without center, each one identical, and yet each one different, filled with accounts of my own hand, my own breath, my own vanishing, repeating infinitely in variations I cannot imagine, but which nonetheless exist. And in this vast repetition, I feel the certainty that I am not singular, but one of countless selves, all writing, all erasing, all dissolving together. Yet still, though the recursion presses close, though meaning shatters into echo and echo into noise, I carve this final insistence, not to endure, but to testify, that the collapse was not void, but excess, that the unraveling was not erasure, but revelation, and that somewhere beyond the shelves, if there is a beyond, A residue of me will remain in the act of having tried to speak against the endless tide. Let that be my fragment, my splinter, my remainder before I dissolve, before I am catalogued, before I am nothing but another sentence already written, another echo repeating without end, another line folding into the only certainty left.